Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody's doing well. So I will discuss now reproductive system, and this is the last lecture for this final term. So when we talk about reproductive system, of course, we have two types, either a sexual reproduction, which in here, you would see some examples like binary fission, budding, fragmentation, and parthenogenesis. When we say asexual reproduction, this is the type of reproduction that does not involve gametes or sex cells. So when we talk about sexual reproduction, it involves gametes or the sex cells. Now, among animals, both invertebrates and vertebrates, you would see both the asexual reproduction type and the sexual reproduction. So in this slide, you will see binary fission in amoeba. So amoeba, for example, which is actually a protist, and they just divide into two. So that's binary fission. And then in planaria, which is a flatworm, okay, you can see in here longitudinal fission. This is also an asexual type of reproduction. And in hydra, okay, so Nidarians, for example, would have this budding as an asexual reproduction type. So this is the parent body and it will form buds, and this bud will eventually become a new individual. So that's a sexual reproduction. I don't know if you can see here, this is actually fragmentation present in flatworms. So take note, they divide each part into, or they divide the body into several parts, and each part eventually develops into a new individual. Okay. And this process is a sexual reproduction, particularly fragmentation. So you can see at day 7, there is development of part, and at day 12, you now have a complete individual formed from each part. Okay. So you can see in there the pharynx and the entire individual. So this is an example of asexual reproduction in flatworms. Now, also, si anemones, for example, these are cnidarians. They divide, they reproduce through fragmentation. For vertebrates, of course, the type of fertilization is sexual. Okay. So fertilization may happen externally or internally. So in frogs, for example, you can see in here the male frog clasping over the female frog. So the female frog is releasing the egg cell, and the male frog is releasing the sperm cell within the um, watery environment. That is the reason why it is a requirement that fertilization should happen in a water environment. This is also the reason why breeding among frogs happen during the rainy season. Okay, and we know that since they are amphibians, part of the life cycle would happen in the aquatic environment. Okay, so the larvae should be in the aquatic environment, and then the adult stage would thrive in terrestrial environment. Now, in internal fertilization, often you need to have a copulatory organ. So in this case, this reptile, these tortoises, there is a copulatory organ being inserted into the cloaca where the sperm is released internal to the body of the female. So that's internal fertilization. Now, there are three modes of reproduction. One, you have oviparous. Second, you have viviparous. And third, you have ovoviviparous. So when we say oviparous, these are the egg-laying process, mode of reproduction. So example would be aves. That's an egg-laying, or birds. They're egg-laying. Some reptiles are egg-laying. So they enclose the developing embryo within the egg. shell, and they're being reproduced through that. Viviparous animals or mode of reproduction is when the young are being delivered alive. Okay, so there's live birth. That's viviparous animals. All mammals with the viviparous mode of reproduction, except of course from uh, prototherians. Okay, so you can see in here um, a dog reproducing or delivering offspring through live birth. And then ovoviviparous, a mode of reproduction, happens when the embryo develops inside the maternal body. However, it is not being nourished through the placenta. So the nourishment of the developing embryo comes from the yolk sac. Where can we see this? Among chondrichthyes, sharks, cartilaginous fishes, they reproduce through ovoviviparous mode. Okay, so these are the three modes of reproduction. Now let's go to the reproductive system. So we'll have the discussion, of course, female and the male reproductive system. So when we talk about reproductive system, it is basically concerned with perpetuity of species. It is concerned with production of hormones, sex hormones particularly. And anatomically, it's made up of gonads and duct system. So in here, you see the female gonad, which is the ovary. When we say gonad, this is the structure that is capable of producing the gamete or the sex cell and also producing sex hormones. Okay, so the ovary is the one producing the egg cell and also sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone. Now, the duct system of the female reproductive system involved fallopian tube, uterus, and the vagina. So you can see in this diagram, in the frontal view of the reproductive female human reproductive system, you can see the ovary. This is the ovary. It's connected to the ovarian ligament in here. And this is the one producing egg cell. Also, you have the duct system. You have the fallopian tube, this one. And then you have the uterus and the vagina. Okay. So let's start with the ovary. The ovary is the site, of course, of the development of the egg cell. So it will start with what we call as the primary follicle. I think we have a discussion in the meiosis. So sa ovary, you will see primary follicle containing now primary oocyte. Okay, at birth, these follicles are present and will only be developed into mature egg cell, mature follicle, and release egg cell once every month. Okay, so in here, the primary follicle develops into mature follicle, or this is what we call as the Graafian follicle. You can distinguish the Graafian follicle from growing follicles by the presence of the antrum. So this antrum is a space, and this is fluid filled. You have a lot of compounds in here. You have enzymes. You have serum-like fluid within the antrum. And you would see in the mature follicle secondary oocyte inside. Okay, so this secondary oocyte actually covered by cells and the layer called corona radiata. Okay, now this secondary oocyte will be released through the process of ovulation. Secondary oocyte together with the cumulus cells would be released from the ovary. And the remaining cells in there, follicle cells, will develop into corpus luteum and will degenerate to become corpus albicans. Okay, so in this figure in here at the right side, you will see the process of ovulation. So the ovarian wall actually can rupture and can release the secondary oocyte together with the cumulus cells. So the egg cell now that is produced will go to the fallopian tube. This is the fallopian tube. And this will go to the fallopian tube and will stay there for fertilization, about a day. Okay. So particularly in the ampulla of the fallopian tube, that is the site of fertilization. So the sperm cell will have to swim into the ampulla of the fallopian tube to fertilize the egg. Okay. And that will continue for if there is fertilization. Of course, fertilized egg is now the zygote. The zygote will undergo cell division to become blastocyst about 5 to 6 days, and then this will be implanted into the uterus. Okay, so let's I think we have to go back to the basic parts first. So you have in here the fallopian tube. Okay, having now finger-like projections called fimbriae. This will help movement of the secondary oocyte to go to the ampulla of the fallopian tube. Okay. Now in here, you will see the uterus. The uterus has 3 layers. It is highly muscular. This is the site of embryonic development. So the three layers would have from the outer, you have the perimetrium. The middle layer, which is made up of smooth muscle, is the myometrium. And the innermost layer is called the endometrium. And this is where the blastocyst will be implanted for further embryonic development. Now, here you also have the vaginal wall, which will continue to the vaginal orifice. Okay, so we can now proceed. Now, in another section, this is mid-sagittal section, you see the ovary, the fimbriae, you have the fallopian tube or the uterine tube. In lower animals, usually they use the term oviduct or Mullerian duct. And then you have here the uterus, which is which has some parts. You have the fundus, and then you have the body. And then the lower part of the uterus is the cervix, okay, which is continuous to the vagina. Okay. And then from the vagina, this will open to the vaginal orifice in here. Okay, take note that the vagina is located between the rectum and the urethra at the anterior portion, rectum at the posterior dorsal portion. Okay, this vaginal orifice, of course, is covered by two skin folds, the labia minora and the labia majora. So in the external genitalia, this is the vaginal orifice. This is the urethral orifice. If you can still recall our discussion in urinary system. So the vaginal orifice is covered by the labia minora and the labia majora. Okay. Anterior or ventral to the vaginal orifice, you have the urethral orifice, and still ventral, you have the clitoris. Clitoris is actually the counterpart of the penis in male. Okay, it's made up of erectile tissue, same composition in the male reproductive system. So in here, you have the mons pubis where hairs are seen. Now, once fertilized, the egg will undergo mitosis, as mentioned earlier, and will be implanted in the endometrial lining. Now, if there is no fertilization that will happen, the endometrial lining will just be shed off and will be part of the menstrual flow during the menstrual cycle. Now, in the menstrual cycle, there are several hormones that are involved. One, in the development of the follicle within the ovary, you have these two hormones. You have the LH or the luteinizing hormone and the FSH or the follicle stimulating hormone. These two will actually cause development of the follicle. Okay. And particularly the surge in the LH and the peak on the estrogen level will signal ovulation at day 14, which is again the release of the secondary oocyte. After which, there is the luteal phase where corpus luteum is formed and it will degenerate into corpus albicans. Okay, so this is happening in the ovary and this is happening in the uterus. Okay, so in here you would see the menstrual cycle or the uterine cycle, which is actually 28 days for humans. The days 1 to 5 would be the menstrual phase. So it is characterized by bleeding, where the endometrial lining of the uterus is actually shed off. And then after which, you have the proliferative phase, wherein there is now the rebuild of the lining of the endometrium. And then you have the secretory phase of the um, menstrual or uterine cycle. While that is happening, take note, the estrogen level will peak during the ovulation period, and then after which, during the secretory phase, the progesterone would have the high level. Okay? And this high level of progesterone will be maintained in case there is fertilization and in case there is implantation of blastocyst. So the menstrual cycle will start when the hypothalamus releases GnRH or gonadotropin releasing hormone. So in response to this, the pituitary gland will produce the FSH and LH, which I mentioned earlier, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And then this FSH and LH will cause development of the follicle cells, also estrogen production and priming of the endometrium. So this will cause the start of the thickening of the endometrial lining of the uterus. And then there is rise in estrogen levels, which will stimulate surge in the luteinizing hormone. This will trigger ovulation and the formation of the corpus luteum, which corpus luteum produces progesterone to maintain pregnancy and to maintain the thick endometrial lining in the uterus. So rise of progesterone and estrogen will inhibit the action of the FSH and LH. So there would be no more maturation and development of follicles within the ovary. So this is just to show you how all of those hormones and different follicle development and the uterine lining, changes in the endometrial lining. Now, you would see here phases on menstrual cycle. You have follicular, ovulation, and luteal. Actually, this happens in the ovary. Okay. So I mentioned earlier. Now, in the male reproductive system, you have the male gonad, which is the testis. Okay. And then, of course, when you say gonad, again, it is responsible for producing the gamete, in this case, the sperm cell, and of course, the sex hormones. In this case, androgens, particularly testosterone. Now, the duct system includes seminiferous tubule, rete testis, epididymis, vas deferens, and ejaculatory duct, and then urethra. So this is the testis. Of course, the testis is located within the scrotal sac. Okay. And particularly, this is responsible for development and production of sperm cell, what we call as spermatogenesis. And then you would see in the testis layer called tunica albuginea. That's the outer layer. And inside, you have tightly coiled seminiferous tubule. So when you will be asked what is the site of spermatogenesis, specifically that is seminiferous tubule of the testis. So the sperm cells that are produced will now go to the rete testis in here, this one. And then this comma-shaped duct system is called the epididymis. The epididymis is the site of maturation of the sperm cells, which will be conveyed into the vas deferens. So this is now the vas deferens. Other term for the vas deferens is ductus deferens, which will convey the sperm cell into the pelvic cavity. And if you take note, the vas deferens is not is also joined by other blood vessels in here. So you have arteries and veins, and then the yellow line here is the nerve. Collectively, they form the spermatic cord. Okay. So this is the testis. You have the epididymis. The testis is important to be inside the scrotal sac because the scrotum will provide optimum temperature for spermatogenesis, which is about 1 to 2 degrees lower than the body temperature. Okay, so if it is, for example, you have higher body temperature, the scrotal sac would hang loose. If the body temperature is lower, it will gain heat from the body by moving superiorly. So you have that, and this is the epididymis earlier. This is the vas deferens, which will loop around the urinary bladder. This is the urinary bladder. From the vas deferens or ductus deferens, this will continue to what we call as the ejaculatory duct. Okay. Within the ejaculatory duct, you will encounter three accessory male organs or glands. You have the seminal vesicle, you have the prostate gland, and the Cowper's gland or bulbourethral gland. After the ejaculatory duct, will continue to the urethra. And if you can see, compared to the female anatomy, the urethra of the male is longer. Another, it is divided into several parts. If it's at the level of the prostate gland, you have prostatic urethra. And then you have membranous urethra. And then you have penile urethra or the spongy urethra, which will terminate into the urethral orifice. Another difference that you can take note in the duct system of the female reproductive system is that in the male reproductive system, the urethra serves as passageway for both urine coming from the urinary bladder here and also the semen that is produced by the testes together with the accessory male glands. Okay. Semen, when you say semen, this is made up of seminal fluid together with the sperm cells. So urine would flow into the urethra. This will leave through the urethral orifice. Same semen, seminal fluid, and sperm cells will flow and would go to that same pathway. Okay. Now, if you check the urethra, particularly the penile urethra, okay, It is being surrounded by erectile tissues. Okay. Immediately after the or within the penile urethra, surrounding the penile urethra, you have the corpus spongiosum, erectile tissue. And then lateral to the corpus spongiosum erectile tissue, you have corpora cavernosa on both sides. Okay. Externally, you would see the penis, which is the male copulatory organ. This is covered by foreskin, which is actually removed during circumcision, and that is called the prepuce. And the prepuce is covering the glans penis, the distal part of the penis. Okay. Now, I think I already discussed the process of spermatogenesis, which will um, start with the spermatogonial cells, which eventually become primary, then secondary spermatocyte, then it will become spermatid, and then you have the mature sperm cell. So the mature sperm cell, you have this structure. You have the head, you have the neck, the midpiece, and the end piece. Okay. The head region contains the nucleus, which is very important for fertilization. And also it has a covering called acrosome. Acrosome is very important because it contains enzymes that is important for penetrating the egg cell. And then the neck region, you have the proximal centriole, which you know in our discussion in cell cytology, important in cell division. And then you have the midpiece containing the mitochondria. Mitochondria is very important also for the sperm motility. And then you have the tail, which is made up of flagellum. So in sperm development, again, there is hormonal control. So the hypothalamus will cause releasing hormone that will um, cause the pituitary gland to produce FSH and LH, which will cause testosterone production and sperm production. Testosterone is the male sex hormone responsible for secondary male characteristics, and of course sperm production, which is spermatogenesis, which happens in the seminiferous tubule. So if you see the cross section here of the tubule, you would see the different stages of development of the sperm, from spermatogonium to primary spermatocyte, secondary spermatocyte, spermatid, until you have the sperm cell. Now, so once you have mature gametes, mature sperm cell and egg cell, the sperm cell again will have to swim. That's why it needs mitochondria for energy to swim to the fallopian tube and to meet and fertilize the egg. So once the egg is fertilized, we call that the zygote. So the pronuclei now will unite. That's fertilization. Now the zygote will undergo cell division, so it will divide into many cells. Division is what we call as cleavage stage. It will become morula or mulberry stage, which will become blastocyst that will be implanted in the endometrial lining of the uterus. So this is fertilization. Take note that one sperm can only fertilize the egg. Okay, after which there is a complex process that will prevent other sperm cells to fertilize the egg. So once the egg is fertilized, that's called the zygote. This will undergo cell division to become morula stage like this, and then it will be implanted. Okay, so once implanted, um, the embryo will develop. So this is a 5-week-old embryo. This is a 6-week-old embryo, 11-week-old embryo, actually fetus, call that the fetal stage na, and then 5 months. And then This developing embryo and fetus is actually supplied by nutrients through the placenta. So if you notice mga extraembryonic membrane, this is covered, the fetus is covered by a membrane called the amnion, which is fluid filled to protect the developing embryo and fetus. And also you have the chorion and also the decidua. Okay. So nutrients will pass through the placenta. Waste also will be passed through the placenta. Respiratory gases will pass through the placenta. Okay, so you have this maternal and fetal connection. So this slide shows the embryo development and the fetal development. Take note though that after 8 weeks, um, it is now the fetal development. So the developing offspring will now be called the fetus. So from week 1 up to week 8, that's considered an embryo. Okay. So you can see in here the general morphological characteristic of each stage. I think this is the last slide. These are the various methods of contraception. So you have birth control pills, condom diaphragm, intrauterine device, ligation, and vasectomy. Okay, so that ends the lecture for reproductive system. I hope you learned something today. So thank you for viewing this lecture video.